When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us every week for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Gregg, and I'm Oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm Oldish. Welcome to this episode of Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. So, Gregg, today is Columbus Day, or is it Indigenous Peoples Day? We could call it either. This seems like a good time for you and me to talk about the history in our own lives of this day and how we grew up with it being called Columbus Day. And now there's consideration for it being Indigenous Peoples Day and what that feels like for us as oldish people. But I thought I'd start before you and I just get into talking about what this is all like for us and probably others that are listening, is to just give a little bit of a history of Columbus Day and then the appearance of Indigenous Peoples Day. So Columbus Day commemorates the landing of Christopher Columbus on October 12th, 1492 in the New World. He was a native of Genoa, Italy. It became a national holiday in 1937 per proclamation of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was sent by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, which, as I'm saying this is what we grew up on. This is what I grew up on. That sounds as familiar as anything else that I learned in history and in my whole life. Since it started in 1937, in our whole life, we've been celebrating Columbus Day. But what came along was the idea of changing the name of this day from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. This name change was proposed by Indigenous people around 1977 at a United Nations conference. The goal of that presentation at the UN conference in 1977 was, one, to counteract the anti-Indigenous discrimination that had been going on forever, as well as, two, the inaccurate narrative that Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, which in fact had been inhabited for millennia by over 600 indigenous nations. That name, Indigenous Peoples Day, is still not recognized as a federal holiday. What has happened is places like South Dakota recognize it officially. They were the first state to do so in 1990. But in 1990, they called it Native American Day. Since then, the city of Berkeley in California embraced Indigenous Peoples Day in 1992, and they picked that time to protest the 500th anniversary of Columbus Day. Now, numerous states and more than 130 cities observe the holiday. And you'll be happy to know, Gregg, that Maine is one of those states, and Vermont are the only two states in New England to officially recognize Indigenous Peoples Day. But there's many cities, including Boston and others in Massachusetts, that have chosen to celebrate Indigenous People Day and celebrating the continent's original inhabitants. there's also a focus that has emerged over time about one reason why to change it to Indigenous Peoples Day was an awareness of the genocide that occurred following Columbus's journey to the New World and the genocide of Indigenous peoples. And just as an aside, Columbus was eventually imprisoned due to those atrocities. Which, as we talk, I just want to talk about how could it be that all these years we've celebrated Columbus Day when way before we started celebrating Columbus Day, he was actually imprisoned due to the atrocities that were committed. And I just want to end as far as this little overview in just saying, what does the word Indigenous mean? What is the definition of Indigenous? And one way to define it is related to or being a people who are the original, earliest known inhabitants of a region. So that's my little overview. I just thought it might be helpful as you and I talk about just our own feelings and experiences around Columbus Day / Indigenous Peoples Day.
I remember it really well from when we were kids. It was kind of a big deal. Columbus was presented to us as a hero. But even then, while the depiction of indigenous peoples that persisted in the European colonizers' cultural media, in particular, books, comic books, television shows, movies, was the heroes were the Europeans, and what we called Indians were the bad guys. But even early on, it was clear that there was something wrong with that picture. For one thing, the first thing that I remember being wrong with the whole Columbus picture was he didn't even know where he was. You know, he referred to these people as Indians because he thought he was in India. I mean, so Great Navigator got halfway there and said, okay, this is all, and stopped, found some people who he didn't recognize at all, and immediately started doing terrible things to him, like immediately. I remember that he was imprisoned part, but I didn't remember until you just said it, and I don't have a clear recollection of knowing this when I was a kid, that he was imprisoned for his atrocities. And so I say to that, good for them, because, I mean, they killed people, and there were inadvertent atrocities, which were related to advertent atrocities, which is they brought syphilis from Europe to what they were then calling the New World, the Western Hemisphere. They brought syphilis along with them, and they didn't distribute syphilis into the indigenous population by showing them movies. They distributed it by raping them. So pretty good atrocities right out of the box. And that started the whole genocide wheel rolling that's still rolling today. You know, the genocide includes not only wiping out the people, but wiping out their culture. And that continues today. So I remember that from when I was a kid.
It's interesting because what I remember as a child, first of all, was how ubiquitous Columbus Day was. We celebrated it every single year in elementary school. The celebrations were probably basically identical, making pilgrim hats, making Indian feathers, and talking about Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1942 was just so staple of our history. And the other thing I remember that comes to me in my memories is that the Thanksgiving feast. So my image as a little girl, always looking for kindness and acceptance and inclusion, was how wonderful it was that these people came to our country. And I know it's a little bit different than Columbus. Well, it was celebrated. We did this on Columbus Day. You know, how wonderful it was that we would dress up in elementary school, and some of us would have our pilgrim hats on, and some of us would have our Indian feathers, and we'd sit down at the table together. And the story was that the pilgrims kindly gave food to the Indians, which I thought maybe they were starving or something. And so these amazing white people came along and, changed their lives forever by caring about them. And wasn't that wonderful? And they sat down in peace and enjoyed this wonderful meal together, and the end. So that was my childhood experience. As I got older and started to learn how Native Americans were actually treated and Indigenous peoples, I didn't make the connection of Columbus Day, the actual holiday that comes on our calendar. I'd kind of lost track of what is it we're actually saying when we sit down to have Thanksgiving together. And it had turned into a family holiday, and that we might decorate our table with Thanksgiving decorations. When the term Indigenous Peoples Day came along, I was confused. I thought, can I change how I even think about this holiday that has been ingrained into my thinking since I was 6, probably in first grade?
It's kind of interesting because there was a huge time gap between Columbus getting into the Caribbean and the Pilgrims landing in New England. But you're right. They definitely were conflated. I grew up in New England. I grew up like 30 miles from Plymouth. And those two things were definitely conflated. Like Columbus had something to do with the founding of America. But he didn't really. The history is a little crazy because he was sailing under the flag of Spain, and Spain and England were at war at the time that Columbus came over. Of course, first of all, again, he didn't think he was in a new place. He thought he was in India and that he was claiming India for Spain. And lots of people were trying to get to India. The Portuguese and the French and, everybody in Europe was trying to get to India, and he thought he found a different route. But then he found these people, and Columbus was followed fairly early on by other people from Spain who, boy, that whole history of the Spanish march across Latin America was just, holy crap. They just, wherever they went, they killed, they raped, they looted, they enslaved, they destroyed religions, they destroyed cultures over and over again. And I used to think when I was a kid and I first learned about all the stuff that Spain was doing, I said, boy, us Northern Europeans, us English and Irish and whatnot, we weren't as bad as that. But then I started learning more about the kinds of stuff that we did, and, the Trail of Tears and purposely giving Native Americans blankets infected with smallpox because that was a good way to get rid of them while looking good. And it's like, holy crap. And the white people sitting down to share their meal with the Native Americans at Thanksgiving, we actually were taught that backwards. As English people, half of them starved to death, another quarter of them died from diseases, and Thanksgiving was actually food that was brought to them by the Native Americans who had almost enough to share. And they shared even with people that were not at all nice to them.
I feel so incredibly angry and sad that this, in a way, like, I don't even want to say the name Columbus Day, but it makes me think about where we are in our country right now. It almost feels like I don't want to probably get too much into politics, but when you think about some states, that state that shall not be named, who's trying to erase racism, erase differences, I feel like Columbus Day was certainly not the only, but a huge influence on how white people wanted everyone to think about ourselves. And I also just want to say, as a woman of color who was raised without knowing my cultural background, I feel robbed because I feel like, I wonder what it would have been like if I'd grown up in a family, African-American family, what this looked like for them. because it wasn't their story. It's not my story culturally. And so I'm thinking about that too. It's so interesting as I was preparing for this episode and as we're talking today, I am just feeling so angry and disgusted. So I'm angry that that was what was fed to me as a student, no matter what my race is. And I'm disgusted that here we are all these years later, that so many people are so ignorant. And I don't mean that in a judgmental way, just as a factual way of what this holiday, when it's called Columbus Day, means. And I know everyone doesn't agree with me, and maybe some of you listening right now don't agree. So, we're just sharing our own stories here, Gregg and me, and would love to hear from you, whatever your thoughts are. But it seems pretty stark to me that calling this day Columbus Day is an insult to everybody. It is insult to thinking white people to know that that went on. And then so insulting to people of color and to Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, it seems funny to celebrate the arrival of the first of the destroyers. We were kind of taught that Columbus was the bringer of civilization to the New World, but there was one of the things that I think is, you were talking about ignorance, is I'm pretty sure that most people don't, certainly people who went to standard public schools the way that we did, would be surprised to learn that there were millions of people already here, not just random bands of savages. There were millions of people in North and South America. Millions. And now there's hardly any.
And for as the formal record that I was reading used the word for millennia.
Yeah.
That these millions and millions of people who originated in these areas were here forever. And then this white guy comes along with his boat full of white men and decides they're not important, they're not humans, they shouldn't be treated with any kind of acknowledgement, let alone maybe caring or respect or appreciation, that they're going to be able to share all that they know about this area.
Yeah. I think it's important for us, now that we're oldish and can begin to understand this. And one of the positive aspects of oldishness is that we can, if we're still at it, so to speak, we can begin to understand differently how we got here. We can undo some of the programming that we had. We can take another look at things that we were told when we were younger, were taught when we were younger. And it wasn't just somebody told us stories. If you go into any school in America at the time that we're growing up, it's just the fact that it's called America, that's has nothing to do with the people who are here. They named it after the navigator who bumped into it. They couldn't name it Columbus or any of that because he turned out to be a major criminal. But so they named it after the navigator who didn't know where he was. So anyways, we can begin to unravel something that was the victor's story, so to speak, the way the victors told the story, and we can begin to unravel it. And there are a number of lessons in that, including the lessons of compassion. Because if we take the time, as we should, I think, take the time to feel the Indigenous people and the invaders as fellow humans and feel compassion for them in the struggles that were their lives, that can begin to open us up maybe to reduce the likelihood that that sort of stuff will continue. And that sort of stuff is already continuing. It happened, a genocide that happened in my lineage is the Armenian genocide. And there's another one going on now. So, it continues to happen. The people in Nagorno-Karabakh being chased away by the people who took control of their country. So 150,000 people fled from there to Armenia. That was clearly a genocide. So we haven't gotten over the genocide part. I'm not sure that in schools now, though, that we're even now teaching that what happened here with the indigenous peoples was a major genocide. And genocide's been going on ever since there were people who could pick up a rock. But the genocide of the indigenous peoples was major. And because the Europeans came out as victors in the struggle, they got to write the history. And so we didn't learn that it was a genocide. People started talking about it as a genocide in the 60s, I think. But that was because of cultural appropriation. You were around in the 60s, and all the hippies decided that the Native Americans had been screwed. So the long hair and feathers and all of that stuff was a cultural appropriation, which doesn't seem to have really taken. But for a few years there, it was, and so books like the Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee became very popular, but no real changes happened. So maybe with some growth of compassion, and now that we're oldish, the lessons that we can take from everything are opportunities for examining ourselves and looking for ways to expand our own compassion.
I have so much I want to say. I'm so glad you brought in the piece of compassion, because I think it is our only way forward as a people. And that means everybody is to have compassion for each other's failings, for each other's blindness, for the hope that people could see and care. I have two other things that popped up while you were talking. One is just going into a psychological path a little bit. When you talked about that there's always been genocide back as long as there have been people, and it made me start thinking about, okay, if you think of cave people, if that's what they were called, their one goal was to survive the possibility of a lion coming towards their cave, to survive someone coming to take over their cave because their cave could give them safety. And so you think about the fight or flight response that we have as an animal. So that's been in us as we evolved. And then it makes me wonder about, is there a way that we as humans can understand that we don't need to do that all the time anymore? That we don't have to fight, or when we do have to flee when there's danger, and there's still lots of danger. But as far as fighting for our safety, so much of, anyway, so it just made me go down that path of how did we get here? And that is time for us to start to recognize that some of the inherent dangers of the past are not there, and that now we can resolve some of the dangers through collaborative problem solving, being able to work together for a better future. And then I was thinking about what it means for me as an oldish person to have been brainwashed my whole childhood into thinking that white people deserve to be seen as the best, the most powerful, the smartest. And as an aside, no wonder we struggle in such a significant way with being able to see difference as fantastic and so rich. And when you think back to just our childhood, not that long ago, in the scheme of things, continuing to be taught that Columbus was a hero, one of our heroes. So it leads me to myself as oldish, and I don't know how I am processing this. I don't feel like I have, as far as finding out as an oldish person all the ways I was lied to, and all the ways that what I knew and assumed were kind of the bedrock of my understanding are wrong. And it's not like I thought Columbus was great until this moment. As I said, I was learning from an age where I could start to read how the Native Americans were treated and other indigenous peoples. But still, to get to this point where it's like so clear, which might show a lag in my own developmental understanding. But anyway, I'm here, and it goes into other areas where I just assumed things were one way. And now at this point in my life, I'm finding out, no, actually, it wasn't that way at all. And sometimes it just feels confusing. It feels like a betrayal, like how could that happen? How could it happen? And how could the educational system do that? And now here we are again doing that in some parts of the country around educational systems and learning. So I don't know how to process that in a way as an oldish person, other than along with what you're saying about compassion, which definitely has to be a major part of how I process this and move forward.
Yeah, the processing and moving forward is something we just have to do anyway, but there may be some opportunities for radical compassion. For example, that Columbus was not somebody who had been taught in school and had learned growing up, everybody is good, everybody is equal, deserves their own break. But when he met the indigenous peoples, he said, screw that, I'm going to be a jerk and kill everybody. That's not what he was doing. He was acting like a European. That's how people were taught to act, because they could be, by acting that way, they could be instruments of somebody else's wealth and power. So you look at the genocides, and there's always somebody else's wealth and power. And that wealthy, powerful person or persons conned regular people into thinking that those people over there aren't any good. Let's go kill them. So, it's all of our history has been a con job. All of what we call history has been a con job that's been perpetrated by people seeking wealth and power for various reasons. So if we can turn our compassion even onto Columbus, on Indigenous Peoples Day, that's kind of the thing that I go back to over and over again in my relationship with Christianity, is that somebody decided it was okay to let us know that somebody named Jesus might have said, anybody can love their friends. The true test is, can you also love your enemies? And that's radical compassion. So if you can turn your compassionate heart onto Columbus, for people like us, it's relatively easy to turn our compassionate hearts on the people who were murdered. Of course they didn't deserve that. Of course their lives were made horrible by people like us.
Not people like me. I claim the other part of me.
Yeah, I would challenge everybody to feel compassion all the way around there and learn a little bit. Maybe even
Great.
Compassion for Isabella and Ferdinand, although that's harder.
Now, Gregg, in this episode, you have turned my anger and resentment and around, because that is it. You've just nailed it. What would it be like to have compassion towards Columbus and his dark lack of awareness of human equality, the essential need for every person to be seen and appreciated, and to, first of all, to see each other as human. Let's just start there, because I think that the path of Indigenous peoples has been to not be seen as fellow equal humans. It was an extremely dark time. Really, really, really bad, horrible things happened between people, one people's treatment of other people's, which continues to this day. And so along with awareness of these stories, of these facts, of this true history, along with, rage and anger and tragedy, having compassion, and realizing that when people do those things, they are disconnected from themselves as humans, maybe disconnected from themselves in the universal community of humans.
Yeah. Which would be nice if we could manage to create one.
One person at a time, one step at a time, one act of kindness and compassion at a time. That's what we can do.
Yeah. So we'll celebrate Indigenous people on Columbus.
Or we'll celebrate Indigenous people on Indigenous Peoples Day.
Yes. And we'll include Columbus there too. At one
I don't
point.
want to. So one lesson, potential lesson, which did not happen with Columbus, but one potential lesson from what you just said is, can we learn from the way we're treated to turn that into radical compassion? What would it have been like if Christopher Columbus had, when he experienced that and had to leave where he was living, had decided he wanted to show compassion and caring to all peoples? Just think how different the story would have turned out in our history. It just would have been very different.
Yeah, it would have been. Well, it isn't, but we can remain hopeful. I'm not sure celebrate is the right term.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's like, how do we honor this day? Is it celebrating? Is it grieving? Is it social action? Is it learning, helping people even realize what this day symbolizes?
So this is probably a good place to end it. I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
And I also enjoy our conversations and being oldish together. So goodbye for now.
Goodbye for now, Janet.
I really liked that conversation.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. We enjoyed this conversation, and we hope you did too. We clearly have ambiguous feelings about Indigenous Peoples Day and Columbus Day, and expect that some of you do as well, but we hope that you don't have ambiguous feelings about our podcast. We hope that you'll come back and listen with us again next week when we talk about something probably pickleballish, and upcoming episodes that include another session of the Oldish Book Club and conversations with a couple different authors about pickleball and about sex and sexuality as we age. You can leave comments or requests for topics or guests on this or other episodes at www.oldish.me. There's a link there too if you've wondered how you can help support our podcast. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.